Hello and welcome to this review of my Unicomp Mini-M, which is their new keyboard, and it's highly inspired by the IBM Model M SSK, or space-saving keyboard in full. This was sent to me by Unicomp. It's a prototype, so please keep in mind that this isn't necessarily indicative of final production samples. I must admit I don't like reviewing prototypes. I probably wasn't paying attention during correspondence because normally I much prefer to review production samples, but I digress. The IBM SSK is an old TKL version of the venerable Model M keyboard. It was originally produced in quite limited numbers because it was an option rather than a standard keyboard, and at the time a lot of people still used the Numpad, but because nowadays fewer and fewer people use this outstanding function and aim towards smaller keyboards, the SSK later became very desirable and became worth a lot more than the normal M due to its rarity. The SSK tooling was apparently lost sometime around when Unicomp split from Lexmark, and so Unicomp couldn't make these keyboards anymore. But rather than get new tooling to make them again, which admittedly would have been a bit of an investment, they just stuck to making the normal M. Or rather, they instead invested in tooling for the slightly more compact version of the full-size model called the Space Saver. So not Space Saving keyboard, which is what SSK stands for, but it's named similarly. And it's hideous! Who thought that this was in any way acceptable? Anyway, they finally decided to make an SSK again, and thankfully with the same styling as the original wedge case. Now, interestingly, they did change quite a few things under the bonnet, or under the hood in imperial units, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. I have an original, albeit bolt-modded SSK here, which will serve as a comparison model. The first thing you'll note, of course, is the color scheme. The original used a beige case and pebble and pearl keycaps, as it was called, and those were the standard IBM used at the time, but Unicomp chose to go with a black case and bright white and grey keycaps instead. This looks a lot flashier and, in my opinion, better, but it's not quite as tranquil as the original is. But honestly, I think it looks a lot better. Black keyboards rule. Of course, the keyboard really begs for black keycaps, which you can order separately, by the way, but they no longer do printed black keycaps, as the tooling for that was prohibitively expensive to repair given the relatively low demand for them, so you can only get blank black ones. Right now, I'm stuck on the caps from my M13 keyboard, which did use printed black caps, but not all the caps are compatible, of course, which is why the bottom row looks a bit messy, but I think an all-black scheme would look very, very nice. The dye sublimation of the lettering on these keycaps is razor sharp, by the way. They renewed their tooling some time ago and it's definitely paid off. They now look brand new. The alignment still isn't perfect. This is a long-term issue for Unicomp and it's done partially by hand. But overall, I'd say these caps are of a much higher quality than previous Unicomp ones. For the record, they're the one-piece design, which are now their standard type. Another thing they changed is the dimensions of the case. They made the bezels ever so slightly smaller, so the overall width is now 39.5 centimeters compared to the original's 40.3 centimeters. Or in imperial units, gosh darn dag nabbit Myrtle, get the Bible. Compared to modern standard keyboards like these pieces of shit right here, it's a bit smaller but not a huge amount. But it's still compact enough to give you more than enough space to work with, I think. Unless you're one of those freaks that somehow needs their entire desk for their mouse and thus needs a 60%. I mean, seriously, how do you guys mouse like this or something, flailing around like a drunk Glaswegian? Another thing they changed is the addition of lock lights. Yeah, this is something that was actually absent from the original, believe it or not. It's located a bit more to the top and left than you would expect, but that's because there is no lock light recess on TKL models, obviously. It's a useful addition for sure, and thankfully they left off their hideous logo that they put on other locklight stickers, but they stuck blue LEDs in it, which I think isn't as nice as green ones. That's something I'd advise them to switch to because I think that'll look a lot better. And I also think it'll look better more to the right over here, but hey, better this than no locklights at all. Unlike their other models, the Mini-M also comes with the detachable cable, which is pretty cool as that was also part of the originals, although those used an SDL to PS2 cable of course, whereas these are USB thankfully. It locks in place, and originally I had some difficulties getting it in, but it's not so bad really once you know what to do. It's held in place by this metal tab which you can push away to release it. It's a cool feature, but getting it out does require a screwdriver or something because it's not very accessible. And it's also in the way when you're trying to plug it in. Also like the original, it comes with a numpad superimposed as a layer above the right side of the alphanumeric cluster, with the 7, 8 and 9 keys above, you guessed it, 7, 8 and 9. Just like the original, it's toggled on and off with a num lock button, and again like the original, it's accessed with Shift plus scroll lock. There is also a function button here, but that's not used for this, as this numpad is way more clumsy to use, for me at least, than the standard number row. I just leave numlock off all the time here, but it's cool to see that they included it. I think that's a nice little addition. I mean, at the very least it gives you a cool little blue sub-legends, and who doesn't like that? A departure from the original is the matrix though, which has been considerably upgraded. The original had 2-key rollover obviously, being a membrane keyboard, and this one still does too, but they went with a massively expanded 12x16 matrix, so 192 positions for just 87 keys, which means that the matrix is more than half redundant, which drastically reduces rollover issues, and they restructured the traces as well so that fewer keys conflict with each other. Although it is technically still 2-key rollover, I found that it's really hard to get blocking now, especially around the WASD cluster, which they seem to have deliberately traced separately, so that's definitely a good thing. So it's not N-key rollover, but pretty practical in practice nonetheless. They even use different USB descriptors to increase the maximum number of keys that can be held down at the same time to 10, although this won't be a common occurrence. One example is holding down Q through P, by the way. Anyway, in short, this model has considerably fewer rollover conflicts than a normal M. For comparison, their normal 104 key model uses an 8x16 matrix, so 128 positions, 2/3 the size of the SSK matrix, despite having a higher number of keys, so this is definitely better. And of course, the layout is now adapted to be more modern, including Windows keys, the original was Win keyless, and a function key, and they even stuck them in the right order this time. Other than that, it's pretty much the same layout though. Right now they don't have non-US models yet, but they're expected to follow soon, I've been told, something to do with certification, I'm guessing CE compliance. Build quality wise, it's quite decent. I mean, come on, it's a Model M, what did you expect? It weighs just under 1.4 kilograms compared to the original, which weighed around 1.8 kilograms, so admittedly quite a lot of weight did get lost along the way. It's not quite as tanky as old M's for sure, the materials were made thinner over time after all, but it's still pretty much a beast by today's standards. The sound is of course different from the original. It uses a different case, caps, plate, and even the thickness of the insulating mat is different, so you're bound to end up with a different key sound. Unfortunately, my own SSK is bolt modded, so that's not a valid comparison either, but I'll give you a taste of what it sounds like. I'd say it's a bit louder than old Model M's and higher pitched, but it still sounds like an M basically. I do have one annoying issue with this one. After booting up the computer, it doesn't actually send any scan codes. I have to manually unplug and replug the keyboard every time before it works. Apparently the chipset they use doesn't agree with some BIOSes or motherboards or something. Not completely sure what the issue is here. So it still works, but I have to replug it every time I boot the computer up, which is annoying. Overall, it's a pretty good keyboard. If you want an SSK, this is a good option, especially as at $121, it'll be about a third of a second-hand original IBM SSK. And although it's a bit lighter and the die sub alignment isn't as good, in some ways it's actually better than the original. It's slightly cheaper than mainstream TKLs from major manufacturers even, and of course it's buckling spring, so it's got much better switches than clicky MX type keyboards, plus it's got massive chunks of die sub PBT for keycaps, so all in all I'd say this is a very legitimate purchase. The only thing it doesn't have is RGB, but really who gives a shit about that anyway? That's it for this review. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it. And following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.